Dear brothers and sisters, what a privilege it is to gather once again to study Jehovah's Word together in congregation Bible study. Tonight, we have two lessons that blend beautifully to teach us about faithful service and the power of loyal friendship. In Lesson 100, we will examine the close bond between Paul and Timothy. We will see how Timothy was trained from infancy by his mother and grandmother, how Paul noticed his sincere heart and took him along as a fellow worker, and how Timothy developed into a shepherd who genuinely cared for the brothers. Their friendship reminds us that the strongest bonds in the congregation are built on shared faith and selfless service. As we study, let's ask ourselves, do I value the training I have received from faithful ones? Am I cultivating friendships like that of Paul and Timothy? And when storms come, do I trust completely that Jehovah will bring me through? May these lessons build our faith and deepen our love for the God who always keeps his promises. Let's start. Who was Timothy? Timothy was a young brother in the congregation at Lystra, a city in Asia Minor. His father was a Greek, and his mother, Eunice, was a Jewish believer. Along with his grandmother Lois, Eunice taught Timothy the holy writings from his infancy. So from the time he was a very small child, Timothy was being shaped by the truth of Jehovah's Word. That foundation prepared him for something remarkable. When the Apostle Paul visited Lystra during his second missionary tour, he noticed something special about Timothy. The brothers in Lystra and the neighboring city of Iconium spoke highly of him. Paul observed that Timothy genuinely loved the brothers and was eager to serve, so Paul invited him to join him on his missionary travels. That decision changed Timothy's life, and it also changed the early Christian congregation, because Timothy became one of Paul's most trusted fellow workers. Timothy traveled with Paul through Asia Minor and into Europe. He helped establish and strengthen congregations in places like Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. Paul often sent Timothy back to congregations that were facing trials, because he knew Timothy had a disposition that genuinely cared for the concerns of others. As Paul wrote to the Philippians, he had no one else of a disposition like Timothy's who would genuinely care for their concerns, while others were seeking their own interests. Next question. Why were Paul and Timothy such good friends? The friendship between Paul and Timothy was not built on superficial things like shared hobbies or similar backgrounds. It was a deep spiritual bond forged through years of shared service, mutual trust, and genuine love for Jehovah and the brothers. First, Paul saw something special in Timothy from the very beginning. When Paul visited Lystra, he noticed that Timothy was well reported on by the brothers. He observed a young man who truly loved the congregation, was eager to serve, and had a sincere faith that first dwelt in his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. Paul recognized that Timothy was not seeking his own interests, but the interests of Jesus Christ. That kind of selfless disposition is the foundation of any strong Christian friendship. Second, Paul invested personally in Timothy. He took him along on missionary journeys, trained him to be a fine preacher and teacher, and mentored him as a spiritual son. Paul called Timothy, "my beloved and faithful child in the Lord." That language shows the depth of their relationship. It was not just a working partnership. It was a father-son bond in the faith. Paul poured into Timothy everything he had learned, and Timothy absorbed it with humility and a willing spirit. Third, they endured hardships together. They faced angry mobs in Thessalonica, they fled for their lives in the night, they preached in dangerous cities, and they saw each other under pressure. Nothing strengthens a friendship more than facing trials side by side and seeing the other person remain loyal. Timothy never abandoned Paul when things got difficult. He was there through beatings, imprisonments, and constant opposition. Paul knew he could count on Timothy, and that trust was invaluable. Next question. What does this lesson teach us about Jehovah? This lesson about Paul and Timothy reveals beautiful truths about Jehovah's personality and how he works. Let's consider several things we learn about our God. First, Jehovah values young ones and sees their potential. Timothy was a young man, possibly still in his late teens or early 20s when Paul invited him to join the missionary work. He may have been somewhat timid, and he faced health problems. In the eyes of the world, he might not have seemed like much. But Jehovah saw a sincere heart, a genuine love for the brothers, and a willingness to serve. Through Holy Spirit, the brothers in Lystra and Iconium gave a good report about him, and Paul noticed his qualities. Jehovah did not dismiss Timothy because of his youth. Instead, he gave him the privilege of becoming one of the most trusted and effective overseers in the first-century congregation. This teaches us that Jehovah is not partial. He does not judge by age, experience, or outward appearance. He looks at the heart, and when he sees a willing spirit, he provides opportunities for service. Second, Jehovah is the one who provides spiritual training through his organization. Paul personally mentored Timothy. He took him along on missionary tours, taught him how to preach and teach, and later wrote him inspired letters filled with counsel. But behind Paul was Jehovah, the grand instructor. Jehovah used Paul to shape Timothy into a fine shepherd. Today, Jehovah trains us through the congregation, through the faithful and discreet slave, through circuit overseers, through elders, and through experienced brothers and sisters. No one is left to grow spiritually on their own. The same God who trained Timothy through Paul is training us today. Next question. What practical lessons can we learn? The account of Paul and Timothy is rich with practical lessons that we can apply in our own lives and in our service to Jehovah. Let's consider several of them. First, we learn the importance of training young ones from an early age. Timothy's mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois taught him the holy writings from his infancy. They did not wait until he was older to begin his spiritual education. They planted the seeds of truth in his heart when he was still very small. That foundation shaped his character and prepared him for a life of service. For parents today, this is a powerful reminder. Teaching our children about Jehovah is not something to postpone. Family worship, regular meeting attendance, and daily conversations about spiritual things can mold a child's heart and set them on a course that leads to lifelong faithfulness. Second, we learn that youth is not a barrier to being used by Jehovah. Timothy was young, possibly in his late teens or early 20s, when Paul selected him for missionary service. He may have been timid, and he struggled with his health. Yet Paul did not overlook him because of his age, and neither did Jehovah. Timothy became one of the most trusted overseers in the early congregation. The lesson for young ones today is clear. Do not let anyone look down on your youth. If you love Jehovah, love the brothers, and are willing to serve, Jehovah sees that heart. There are many opportunities to expand your service, whether it is auxiliary pioneering, Bethel service, construction projects, or simply doing more in the local congregation. Youth is not a limitation. It is an opportunity. The next lesson, Lesson 101. Paul is sent to Rome. Next question. Why did Festus send Paul to Rome? Paul had been arrested in Jerusalem and then transferred to Caesarea, where he was imprisoned for 2 years under Governor Felix. When Festus succeeded Felix, the Jewish leaders immediately tried to convince him to send Paul back to Jerusalem. Their plan was to ambush and kill him on the way. Festus, wanting to gain favor with the Jews, asked Paul if he was willing to go to Jerusalem for trial. But Paul knew the danger. He also knew his rights as a Roman citizen. So he boldly declared, "I am standing before the judgment seat of Caesar, where I ought to be judged. I have done no wrong to the Jews, just as you are very well aware. So if I am really a wrongdoer and have committed something deserving of death, I do not beg off dying. But if there is nothing to the charges these men are bringing against me, no man can hand me over as a favor to them. I appeal to Caesar." At that, after conferring with his council, Festus replied, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you will go." Festus had no choice. The appeal to Caesar was the supreme right of a Roman citizen. Once invoked, the local governor could no longer decide the case. He had to send the accused to Rome for the emperor's tribunal. Next question. What happened to Paul on the way to Rome? Paul's journey to Rome was anything but smooth. It was marked by a violent storm, a shipwreck, and an unexpected stay on an island. Yet through it all, Jehovah's protective hand was clearly evident. After Festus ruled that Paul must go to Caesar, he was placed in the custody of a Roman army officer named Julius and put on a ship bound for Rome. 2 faithful brothers, Luke and Aristarchus, traveled with him. The voyage began calmly, but when they reached the waters near the island of Crete, the weather turned dangerous. Paul advised the ship's crew not to continue, but the centurion listened to the shipowner instead. They set sail again, and soon a violent storm, called the Euro-Aquilo, caught them. For many days, the storm raged without ceasing. The crew threw cargo and gear overboard to lighten the ship. Neither sun nor stars appeared, and everyone on board eventually gave up hope of survival. But Paul was not without hope. At the right moment, he stood up and told the men that an angel of Jehovah had appeared to him in the night with this message, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And look, God has granted you all those sailing with you." Paul encouraged them to take courage, because he believed that it would happen exactly as Jehovah had said. However, he also warned that the ship would run aground on an island. Next question. What does this lesson teach us about Jehovah? This account of Paul's journey to Rome is far more than a travel story. It is a powerful revelation of Jehovah's qualities and how he works with his servants. Let's consider several things we learn about our God. First, Jehovah always fulfills his promises. Jesus himself had told Paul in a vision that he would bear witness in Rome. Years passed. Paul was arrested, imprisoned in Caesarea, and faced powerful enemies who wanted him dead. But Jehovah never forgot that promise. Even when a violent storm threatened to sink the ship and everyone on board gave up hope of survival, Jehovah sent an angel to reassure Paul, "Do not be afraid. Paul, you must stand before Caesar." Not even the fury of the sea could stop Jehovah's word from coming true. This teaches us that we can have absolute confidence in every promise Jehovah makes. Whether it is the hope of the resurrection, the promise of a new world, or the assurance that he will never abandon us, Jehovah's word never fails. As Joshua said, not a word failed out of all the good promises that Jehovah your God had spoken. Second, Jehovah is the protector of his people. The storm at sea was so violent that Luke described it as a tempestuous wind. For 14 days the ship was battered, and the sailors had no control. Human effort was useless, yet not a single life was lost. Jehovah had promised Paul that everyone on board would be safe, and all 276 people survived the shipwreck. This reminds us that when Jehovah decides to protect, nothing can undo his protection. It does not mean we will never face storms in life. Paul certainly did. But it means that Jehovah can bring us through any storm intact according to his will. His arm is not short. Next question: what practical lessons can we learn? The account of Paul's journey to Rome is packed with practical lessons that touch our daily Christian life and strengthen our faith. Let's consider several of them. We learn that we can trust Jehovah's promises completely. Paul had received a promise from Jesus himself that he would bear witness in Rome. Years later, when he was trapped in a storm so violent that all hope of survival was gone, it may have seemed that the promise would not come true. But Jehovah sent an angel to reassure Paul, and every detail was fulfilled. When we read promises in the Bible, such as the resurrection hope or the end of suffering, we may at times wonder how they will be fulfilled. Life can be like a storm that seems to erase all hope, but Jehovah's word never fails. We can cling to his promises just as Paul clung to that vision. He said, "I believe God that it will turn out exactly as it was told to me." That same confidence can be ours. We learn the value of loyal companions. Luke and Aristarchus voluntarily traveled with Paul, even though it meant sharing in his risks and hardships. They did not have to go. They chose to stand by their brother. Later, when Paul was approaching Rome, brothers from the city walked many miles to meet him. Just seeing them caused Paul to thank Jehovah and take courage. This shows how much we need one another. In the congregation, we should treasure the brothers and sisters who stand with us during difficult times, and we should strive to be that kind of companion for others. A visit, a phone call, a simple message, or showing up when someone is hurting can give a brother or sister the courage they need to keep going.